Good afternoon, good evening, and good morning to all of our viewers, and welcome to Pure Malt TV, the Instant Innovation Series. In today's episode, we will be looking at the slightly more niche and crafty sector of blondes, bocks, and bitters. Whilst overall beer growth has been modest in recent years, the craft segment continues to demonstrate strong growth, with a recorded 4% increase in volumes from 2018 to 19. Shortly, I will hand you over to my colleague Ron Dushansky, who will share with you some interesting techniques to consider when innovating in the red beer and ale style category. Ron has a long and experienced background within the global brewing industry, initially training and fulfilling multiple roles with Bass Brewers, and laterally leading operations at Ward's Brewery in Sheffield as head brewer. Before joining the Pure Malt team in 2013, Ron led technical sales for DSM Brewing Enzymes. Before I hand you over to Ron, let me please invite you all to make use of the questions and answers function within Zoom, which you will find at the bottom of your screens. Our team will be monitoring this throughout the webinar, and we will do our best to answer any questions that you may have. As with all of our other webinars, this session will be recorded and distributed after by way of follow-up, as will all the questions and answers that we receive during the course of the session. So without further ado, down into Sheffield, and Ron, it's over to you.
Recent times have seen a revival of interest and demand for traditional and specialist beers. Styles that are well known in many regions, and this has remained constant through the years in some regions, but certainly is a more interest in recent times. Although lager remains the most popular beer style globally, brewers are now encouraged to be innovative with ales and darker beers. Here we'll look at some techniques that could be used to differentiate and modify beers in this style range. But first I'd like to talk briefly about the chemical composition of brewing water that will typically be used for these styles. Water has a major role in brewing, as it is the major component of the final product. It has an influence on flavour, mouthfeel, and the drinkability of beer. Historically, brewing centres grew around sources of water which was suitable for brewing, and to a great extent it was water which drove the development of different beer styles. For example, Burton-on-Trent for ales, Dublin for stouts, and Pilsen for lagers. Here we have a table of different water supplies and also different ionic compositions of various beer styles. In terms of water sources, perhaps the most striking contrast are between the sources in Burton and Pilsen. Burton water typically has very, very high dissolved solids levels, particularly calcium and sulfate, whereas Pilsen, you can see, has very, very low ionic composition, so very low dissolved solids. And unsurprisingly, the beers for which these locations are famous are lager styles for Pilsen, and typically ales and bitters for Burton-on-Trent. The first consideration for brewing water is that it must be potable, and that is fit to drink and free of pathogens. Of the ions present in brewing water, some have a greater impact on beer processing and final beer quality than others. I'd like to focus on 4 ions in particular: calcium, sulfate, bicarbonate, and chloride. Calcium is critical for control of mash pH, which will influence enzyme activity in the mash, It will also influence protein precipitation in kettle and whirlpool. And finally, calcium is involved in mechanisms which will precipitate oxalate in the mash. And this is important to prevent any oxalate crystals forming in the final product, which potentially could cause gushing and even the possibility of beer haze. Sulfate imparts a dry bittering effect on the palate, and this is obviously an advantage for ales and bitters. If we consider bicarbonate, it's really necessary to control levels of bicarbonate to prevent pH increasing to unacceptable levels in the mash. This would have many adverse effects, including lower enzyme activity, reduced protein precipitation, and increased extraction of tannins and polyphenols, which potentially could lead to stability and flavor issues later on in the final product. Ideally, we should be targeting 50 milligrams per litre as a maximum for levels of bicarbonate. Finally, a brief mention of chloride. Chloride imparts palate fullness to the final product. And if we consider this effect of palate fullness along with the drying and bittering effect of sulfate, it's no surprise that these two ions in combination form a critical balance in the production of ales and particularly bitters. A ratio of one part chloride to two parts sulfate is typical for ales and bitters. For darker beers, such as bocks and porters, this ratio is actually reversed. So the smoothing effect of chloride is emphasized. In terms of typical levels, for ales and bitters, we'd be looking at around about 120 parts per million chloride and 240 parts per million of sulfate in the final product. To control ionic composition, a common technique is to deionize the water and add back salts, and this process is known as Bertinization. So typically, as with brewing, there are advantages and disadvantages to the process of deionization and adding back salts. First of all, on the advantage side, it's a very, very simple technique to actually add back salts into the liquor or indeed to the grist or mash. And this will produce a very, very consistent ionic balance and the one that you want for a particular beer style. The techniques used here to deionize are typically ion exchange and reverse osmosis. So on the disadvantage is that obviously CapEx can be required to treat the incoming brewing water. Again, it requires close attention to work production and brew house processes in terms of the salt addition. And it's always sensible to spend some time and attention in terms of analysis to ensure that the correct ionic balance is going forward into the brewing style that's required. It should be noted that incoming water quality to the brewery, be that from borehole or municipal water supplies, can vary considerably. And if a water treatment or a salts addition is being used, you must ensure that the right addition is being made to achieve the final result that's required. I'd like to move on and just look at a couple of techniques that can be used to differentiate products in the area of blondes, hops, and bitters. The first one I'd like to talk about is bottle and cask conditioning. So this technique, or these techniques, have traditionally been used in European brewing, specifically, I guess, British, Belgian, and German brewing. And here, beer is not filtered, carbonated, or pasteurized, but essentially relies on a secondary fermentation of yeast in the final package to produce carbon dioxide to the required level. If an ale yeast is being used, and often is for these beer styles, it's possible to take a fraction of this yeast from the yeast head and add it back to carry out this secondary fermentation of a process known as krausening. But perhaps more usually, a specifically selected yeast is used in particularly bottle conditioning because these it has to be alcohol tolerant and CO tolerant. And this yeast is typically inoculated under very, very controlled conditions. If we focus a little bit on bottle conditioned beers, we'd be looking for a yeast count of around about 50,000 cells per mil at packaging as being optimal to produce the right amount of fermentation, but not too much yeast sediment remaining in the bottle. A critical factor to consider is the amount of fermentable residue that's in the bottle at packaging. This has to be very, very carefully controlled. So the brewer has to be aware of how much residual fermentable sugar there is left in the final beer. And if this isn't sufficient, the brewer then can add typically a priming sugar to ensure that just the right amount of fermentable residue is present. And this will lead to the right amount of carbon dioxide present in the final bottle. As I've mentioned, analysis is critically important in this area. Undercarbonation will obviously lead to a fairly unsatisfying product, so not enough CO2 there. But overcarbonation also is a big risk, leading to excess foaming when the bottle's opened, or even package failure in some cases. So once again, analysis is critical, but also hygiene in the preparation and filling, and the redosing of any yeast that's used is absolutely key. Yeast cultures are typically maintained in wort or sugar for dosing back to bottle conditioned beers, and each one will be specifically selected to deliver not only the right amount of CO2, but again can heavily influence the final flavor of the packaged properly conditioned beer. Moving on to talk very briefly about cask beer. Again, this is a style that's particularly popular over the years in the UK. Here, beer is taken post-fermentation direct from tank and filled into casks, which are not pressurized containers like kegs, but essentially containers where the seal is made using a keystone and chive, so specifically designed items to seal the cask. Yeast count in the tank before filling can be slightly more variable here, so we're perhaps looking at between 50,000 and 2 million cells per mil. But once again, it's critical to have some available sugar there to ferment, actually in the cask, to provide the CO2 that's necessary. Again, if there's not enough fermentable residue there, a priming sugar will typically be added. At the filling stage, many brewers will add dry hops direct to the cask, which is a very popular technique and which really does enable the brewer to play around and differentiate with complex hop aromas. What you have to consider with yeast and hot material present in the final container, it's obviously important to allow this to settle. And typically fining agents are used to accelerate this process. Historically, isinglass finings were used, but more recently, plant-based fining agents are used to achieve this accelerated settlement of hot material, but also yeast and sometimes protein as well, and to form a compact layer in the bottom of the actual cask. So very important to allow settling time actually once it's reached the point of dispense. And that really brings me on to management of cask beer. It's critically important in the supply chain from the brewery to the pub outlet, and also particularly in the pub cellar where handling, hygiene and temperature are all key. Cask beer is best served through a beer engine hand pull device to deliver a bright product with a very, very tight foam, which is a particularly attractive way of serving this product. And this tight foam, to me, is very, very integral to cask beer, and is the ultimate achievement of the brewer. Looking at the advantages and disadvantages of these techniques, you can see that cask beer is a specific type of container, so this can often require more capex to buy the containers necessary to produce this style of beer. Brewery operator skills certainly are required in terms of timely transfers, rapid filling, ensuring high degrees of sterility in the containers before filling. These are all critical. One disadvantage of cask beer is that, again, it's a live product, completely unpasteurized, so again, has a limited shelf life. Typically, this might be 4 weeks from filling to actually coming off dispense. Bottle conditioned beers have a much longer shelf life, in fact, and many will continue to mature even for several years after filling. Again, training is critical, particularly at point of dispense. So training of bar staff and the actual pub management, key to handle cask beer. Hygiene and control of dispense and cleaning, absolutely typical. Again, I've mentioned clarification through fining. So again, this requires a lot of assessment and experience to actually develop exactly the right rate of additions for each particular beer. So it will vary with yeast count, will vary with the beer composition as well. Finally, the beer quality is ultimately in the hands of the bar staff and the people in the pub. So this can be an absolute great situation if the staff are properly trained, but might lead to very, very difficult situations if training isn't key and isn't carried out in a good way. Again, typically the advantages, you might think a few, but they are absolutely significant and make this style of beer worthwhile. So you can utilize existing beer streams, no maturation and filtration, carbonation required, but perhaps more critically, you have unique flavor and drinkability characteristics in this style of beer. Just moving on, the final technique I'd just like to look at is freeze distillation. So freeze distillations typically used to produce a more concentrated end product. It's a technique that's been used for hundreds of years, notably in Germany to produce icebox beer styles, but more recently in North America. And there are many, many brands of ice beer on the market to this day. This technique relies on the fact that ethanol has a much lower freezing point than water. Beer is reduced to a temperature which encourages ice crystals to form. These crystals are then removed, and the overall effect is to concentrate alcohol and also other beer volatiles in the remaining liquid. And the actual alcohol levels that can be achieved, you're perhaps typically talking about doubling the original alcohol content of the mother beer. So for North American ice beers, perhaps typical levels of 5 to 7%, whereas icebox, again, tend to be much higher, really up to 10 to 12% being typical. Again, advantages of disadvantages of this style. You can utilize an existing stream, obviously. It does give you some unique brand differentiation, and it's a very, very effective way of concentrating alcohol and other beer volatiles, but still maintaining smoothness of the final product. So some very, very unique flavor characteristics can be achieved. Disadvantages, of course, you're removing significant quantities of water, so high beer losses, again, reaching 50% in some cases. Can be quite complex processing in terms of removing any ice crystals formed. Some techniques are more complex, where beer and ice slurries are added back to the main beer tank to encourage formation of crystals, which again are then removed. So potentially high capex costs once again, and perhaps a variable batch to batch variation might be typical. Just on a slight side note, this technique has been used in a bit of a race to produce the world's highest ABV strength beer. A few breweries have more or less been in a race to produce this. I'm not 100% sure who holds the record at the moment, but I do know it's perhaps in the high 60s in terms of percentage. So that's quite an incredible level. Finally, I'd just briefly like to mention malt extract, as Simon will be demonstrating some of the materials that can be used to enhance the color and flavor characteristics of box bitters and blonde ales. It's a versatile technique. These crystal and roast malt additions can be added at various points, for instance, wet kettle during fermentation, transfer from maturation to filtration, and even on many occasions, I've known it used in extracts used in final cast for color and flavor modification. We've talked about this technique quite extensively in previous webinars, so I'm not going to cover it at this stage. Suffice to say, it's very, very suitable for small batch addition, so multiple addition points, very low beer loss. Late stage addition can be some of the advantages. Potentially requires beer filtration after addition if sort of bright products are required. And that's, again, one disadvantage. This has not been produced by the brewery, although they have, these extracts tend to have very good provenance in terms of being 100% malt. They are actually produced off-site, and some brewers will like to keep absolutely all materials and brewing on site. So after that very quick summary, I'd like to hand you back to Ross for the rest of the presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Ron, for your very interesting overview of some novel techniques accessible to brewers when innovating in this beer category. It was particularly interesting to listen to you talk about conditioning and freeze distillation techniques. I know, Ron, that you have a background in producing some award-winning cask conditioned beer, so really special to hear you talk about that today. So moving on to the next section of our webinar today, I'm really excited to take you over to a live stream, and it is actually live this time, of Simon from our new brew house here in Haddington. And Simon's going to take you through some of the products from our range which can help brewers to innovate within this category. So Simon, over to you, my friend.
Yeah, thanks, Ross, and thanks everyone for joining. Today we're looking at blondes, bocks, and bitters, and I'm going to be showing you just a few products from the Pure Malt range that can help you differentiate an existing base beer and create your own unique brand extensions, or indeed new brands altogether. So I've got 3 products to show to you today, which will enable us to head off in slightly different directions within this broad ale category, but the overall objective is the same. We're looking to innovate and differentiate by bringing in elements such as sweetness, color, flavor complexity, body, and mouthfeel. So before we start with the tasting, there are just a few things to mention. As with all of the webinars in the Instant Innovation series, a recording will be available. So please don't worry if you don't have everything ready to go now. You will have the chance to follow along at your own pace when watching on demand. If you are going to take part now and join in, then now's a good time to get all of the stuff ready that you will need. We're going to be using 9 glasses or sample cups, a basic set of scales like the ones I have here. Of course, you'll need your Pure Malt product samples and a bottle of each base beer. I'm going to be using a strong lager, a Belgian blonde, and a pale ale as my bases, but you can, of course, use any beer that you have available. It's just a case of adding at the prescribed addition rates. You'll still be able to see the relative impact and taste the relative impact of the specialty malt concentrates. By all means, have a play around and dose to visual color or taste, but just bear in mind that we are talking about relatively low addition rates, generally less than 1% weight vol. The sample packs that you've received contain 2 120-gram bottles of each product, so there's plenty of material there should you want to have a play around, get creative, and conduct your own benchtop trials. Very lastly, the tasting card with the addition rates should now be available in the chat. So let's get started. As I said, I've got 6 glasses laid out here, 2 for each product, 1 for a control and 1 for the sample. If you were with us for the Premium Pilsner webinar, you would have seen us using these sample cups. We'll weigh out the extracts in these sample cups. We can then add a small portion of the base beer to the extract and make a pre-dilution. It gives us a chance to give it a good mix, and we get a nice homogeneous sample when we add it back to the base. Essentially what we're doing is a simple simulation of adding the beer in the brewery when the beer is subject to turbulent flow. So the first product we're going to look at is Pure Malt CB220-65. Now, to produce this product, we blend a dark crystal malt with a smaller portion of lighter caramel malt, and the result is a really interesting and characterful product. You get the rich amber hue coming from the crystal malt, along with some drier caramelized notes, and you also get a balance with some additional sweetness and body coming from the caramel malt. So a really interesting product. I'm going to be using as my base for this one a premium lager. It's a 5.5% Pilsner, and I'm going to use an addition rate of 0.6% weight vol. So that equates to 0.9 grams in 150 mils of beer. So we'll start by pouring our beer, and then we'll go on to weigh out the extracts. So 150 mils here for the control. And 150 mils for our product sample. I'll try and take it nice and steady here so you can follow along at home if you want to join in. And we'll take our scales and we're going to weigh out 0.6% weight vol. So for me, that's 0.9 grams for a 150 ml sample. just tear the scales. Need to be slightly delicate with this one, guys, just because we're talking again about fairly small quantities here. So up to 0.9. There we go. You'll get the hang of it as we go along. And now we're going to make our pre-dilution. So I'm going to add a small amount of this lager to the extract. And again, it just gives me a chance to give it a good mix. We want to see that extract dissolve nicely, which it's doing now. You see it happens relatively easy. And then we can add it back to the base. There we go, back into the base here. There we go, so CB20 added to the base, and I'm going to hold these up in front of the white background here, so those of you who aren't joining in can have a look, see what's happening to the color. So you can see that warm amber red color coming from the crystal malt, and at 0.6%, we're increasing the color by around 15 EBC. So this would sit comfortably within the realms of the box style. And on tasting, if you compare to the control, you're hopefully picking up some of that malty complexity, some of the drier caramelized notes coming from the crystal malt, but also some balanced sweetness and also some body coming from the caramel malt. So it really helps to support that elevation from a premium lager to a more malt-forward bock. So I'll just give you a minute to have a taste and make your own assessment of that. Plenty of character coming in there from the CB220. The next product we're going to look at is CB465. Now this product is a 100% dark crystal malt concentrate. Brings forward that rich red tone and also the dry crystal caramelized flavor, some slightly toasted notes in there as well. We're going to be using for this one an addition rate of 0.8% weight vol. So that equates to 1.2 grams in our 150 ml sample. And my base beer for this one is a rare, fairly lively Belgian blonde or golden ale. So we'll start by pouring out some beer. Again, it's 150 mils, a glass for the control, and then a glass for our sample. I've had lots of foam with this one, so I'm just going to take my time. So 150 mils going in there for our base beer. Now I'm going to weigh out my extract. So CB400 on the scales. Again, need to be fairly delicate with this. We're only talking about 1.2 grams here. So there we go. So CB400 into the sample cup, and we'll do our usual pre-dilution. So a small amount of the base coming into the extract here, and give that a good mix. Lots of foam being created here, so it's just a case of being patient. And we'll dissolve nicely now. We'll add that back into the base. And you'll see a fairly instant impact with this one, if I can get it to go through the foam. You might find with this one that some of the color and the flavors sitting in the foam. So I've got a little mixer here, or stirrer, that I'm going to use just to make sure we get a nice homogeneous mix. Here we go. Okay. Probably lost a little bit in the foam. I'm just going to top that up. So this is our 8.5% ABV Belgian blonde. And here we've added the CB400. I'll hold that up in front of the white background. So in the visual there, you can see the development of a rich amber red color. And at 0.8%, we've added around 28 EBC color to the 10 EBC base. So we've taken this towards a red ale. In this case, we're essentially looking at a Belgian red. And on tasting, compared to the control, you're hopefully picking up a fairly robust whack of crystal malt, some caramelized profile, possibly even picking up some licorice. I'm certainly getting it with this combination. So CB400, a really good option for adding bold color and flavor in red beers and ales. Just give you a minute to catch up at home, and we'll get ready for the final product. The last one we're going to look at is Pure Malt Ruby. Ruby is in fact a roast malt concentrate, but it's comparatively light within our portfolio of roast products. It's 6,500 EBC color in its concentrated form versus 17,000 EBC for our darkest liquid. Brings forward fairly subtle roasted character, some caramelized profile, and of course some color for creating darker ales. So for this final one, I'm going to be using a 5.5% ABV hoppy pale ale as my base. So I'm going to measure out my 150 ml control. Nice color on this one. It's 15 EBC to start off with. Lots of hop aroma coming off that, and another 150 mils here for the sample. And we're going to weigh out our extract. The addition rate here is really low. We're looking at 0.2% weight vol, so that equates to 0.3 grams for 150 ml sample. So we need to be really delicate with this one. It's just a few drops. 0.2, one more drop. 0.4, that'll do, near enough. So we're going to make our pre-dilution. We'll take a bit of the pale ale base, add to the extract, and we can give it a good mix. And we can now add that back to the base. Does wonders for the foam as well, Ruby. Good product for boosting your foam. We got a little bit stuck in the glass there, but we'll go with that. So I'll give you a visual on the white screen here. So again, low addition rate here, 0.2%, but it's still increasing the color significantly. We're up 13 EBC, so that takes us to a total color of around 28 EBC and into the region of the traditional bitter ale. Nice color there coming from the Ruby. And on tasting, yeah, it's nice, it's delicate. You're getting some smooth, mild roasted profile, adding a bit of depth to this hop-forward pale ale. Also increasing the body slightly, which is again kind of giving a premium feel and a fuller mouth feel. So it's quite a versatile product, a good one where you're looking for a subtle adjustment, a bit of roast character in some darker ales, also bocks and porters. So finishing up with the Ruby there. And on that, we conclude the tasting for this session. I'd like to say thanks very much for joining in, and I hope you found it enjoyable to experiment with the Pure Malt products. Of course, we'd be delighted to get your feedback and field any questions that you may have after the webinar. If you don't have a direct contact with a member of the team, you can contact us through the website, puremalt.com. There is a chat function where you can ask a question, and you can also use the Let's Talk form at the bottom of each product page. And it goes without saying that we do have a dedicated team of sales managers here, and we'd be very happy to support and guide with any upcoming or pending projects you may have. So thanks again for joining in, and yeah, back over to you, Ross, in the studio.
Thanks, Simon, for your excellent demonstration of how some of the Pure Malt range of brewing concentrates can be used to create novel beer styles within the red and ale category. So that's us now drawing to a close on today's session. And unfortunately, we're nearing on a close to the Instant Innovation series. But what I would like to do is to share with you the final 2 episodes that we have planned for this series. So on Thursday, the 22nd of October, we will go live with our Instant Innovation series, Dark, Schwarz, and Stouts. And this will, as it says on the tin, have a focus towards the darker category of beers, where we will share with you some production techniques in innovating in this space. And also Simon will be back with his virtual tasting, demonstrating how some of the Pure Malt solutions can give you a result in this area. And then on Thursday, the 5th of November, we will wrap up the Instant Innovation series with our Brewmasters virtual roundtable, where we have invited some industry specialists and some experienced brewmasters to join us from the industry to have a discussion about the themes and trends that they see, and also allow you guys as our viewers to ask them some questions and share some ideas that you might have and get some feedback from them. So we're quite excited about these final 2 episodes in the Instant Innovation series, and we would certainly invite you to join us for those. Registration will be available shortly after the conclusion of today's session. So it leaves me now to just thank you for joining us today. It's always brilliant to see some familiar names on the attendees list. And we look forward to hopefully welcoming you back for the concluding 2 episodes. And yeah, I wish you all a very lovely day and a lovely weekend when it comes around. Take care now.